Hey everybody. So what is a hardness value? That's probably not a question you've been asked recently, nor one you asked yourself. But if you've played Minecraft at any point in your life, you've almost certainly come face to face with one. Actually, now that I think about it, in order for you to do pretty much anything in the game, you gotta have at least a bit of an understanding of how hardness values work. So what the hell are they? Well, a hardness value is a single number that every block in the game has. It tells the block one very important thing: how hard it is. Hardness values are the reason you can punch down a tree in a few seconds, but break your fists against stone. It's real simple, but it's a feature that defines the way we play the game in more ways than one. And honestly, it's a little more interesting than you might think. It's almost intuitive, honestly. Everyone knows that if you try to knock down brick with your bare hands, just like real life, you're going to end up wasting a lot of time and pretty much being real disappointed. Contrarily, if you go at it with some sand, you'll be digging through it like nobody's business. But it wasn't always this way. If we go really far back, we arrive in a bizarre time where Minecraft was a dazzling Technicolor nightmare, and a lot of the stuff we take for granted was pretty much non-existent. Infinite worlds, tools, mobs that didn't jump around psychotically, all of these were features that hadn't even been prototyped yet. Early pre-classic and classic versions of the game had a sort of pseudo-creative mode where you could break everything instantly and place down one of, like, 9 whole blocks anywhere you wanted. The first version to implement something similar to the current way breaking works in survival mode was classic version 0.24 Survival Test. It was 2009, they didn't really have to try with the names at that point. Starting September 1st of that year, players could enjoy the thrilling experience of hitting blocks for a few seconds and seeing them break. Some blocks were harder than others, stone took longer than dirt, and these weird fluorescent green ores took longer than stone. Admittedly, you could still break everything with your fists, but this update set into motion a fundamental game feature that we couldn't play survival without today. So how does the game figure out how hard a block is? Well, it's actually really simple, like weirdly simple. There's just this gigantic list that holds the hardness for every block in the game, and the time it takes you to break a block is determined by where on that list it sits. The question here is obvious. What's the hardest block in the game, and what's the softest? Well, the softest is technically a 75-way tie, which I admit isn't super interesting. This is the 0 hardness category, blocks that can be broken instantly regardless of your tools or buffs. It's mostly just inhabited by some redstone stuff, slime blocks, scaffolding, and a massive quantity of plants. Because I mean, what do you expect? They're plants. However, if you want to know the softest block that isn't instantly breakable, the answer's a lot simpler. Only 9 blocks in the game have a hardness of 0.1, the softest a block can be without being instantly destructible, and these blocks are 2 kinds of drip leaf, carpets, candles, 2 kinds of moss, and 3 kinds of snow. But enough of that. You probably don't care about that because you want to know what the hardest blocks in the game are. Unless you don't, in which case I'm sorry for making presumptions. But really, what is it? Well, disregarding obviously unbreakable things like bedrock and barriers, we have a few contenders for which block goes the hardest. Anvils and resource blocks have a substantial hardness of 5. For reference, stone has a hardness of 1.5. Moving up a step, we get to the ender chest and ancient debris with hardnesses of 22.5 and 30 respectively, followed up by a 5-way tie between respawn anchors, glowing obsidian, crying obsidian, netherite, and of course, classic obsidian with a staggering hardness of 50. I swear, man, I gotta play this game more often. Last time I saw this kind of stuff, I was playing Pocket Edition in 2013. But anyway, you might expect that's where our list ends, and in any earlier version, you might be right. But 1.19 introduced a new contender, seemingly out of nowhere, to challenge the obsidian dominance. Everyone, let me introduce you to reinforced deep slate. Not too much is known about this block, other than the fact that it's annoyingly hard to break. How hard, exactly? Well, 55. As of the Deep Dark update, Reinforced Deep Slate beats out Obsidian by an impressive 5 points to be the single hardest block in the game. Or not. You see, even disregarding indestructible blocks, there's still something technically harder than Obsidian and Deep Slate by a massive margin. And it is water and lava. Yes, you heard me correctly, the hardest blocks in the entire game, besides bedrock and such, are lava and water, with an insane in-game hardness of 100, roughly 67 times that of stone. I honestly could not tell you why this is, considering they aren't technically breakable through normal means, but at least now we have an admittedly weird frontrunner to our hardness competition. So, knowing all this, how does hardness affect how long it takes to break a block? Well, these two things have a pretty solid connection. As hardness increases, your breaking time increases by pretty much the same margin. But as you probably already know, hardness ain't the only thing that affects your breaking time. Minecraft has its own little weirdly complicated system of factors and calculations for determining how long you gotta hack away at something in order to break it, and there's a lot of potential things that can impact the final result. Whether or not you're using the correct tool, what material your tool is made of, whether or not you have haste, and a ton of other factors influence your general breaking power, which then affects how long it takes you to break something. There's a couple weird little quirks to the system too, like how gold is technically more effective than netherite at breaking, but usually fails since it can't harvest any significantly hard blocks. And because I was kinda curious and had pretty much nothing better to do, I wrote a really quick and really dirty Python script that simulates Minecraft's own breaking calculator to answer all of your breaking related questions. So, what is the quickest you can possibly break something in the game, disregarding objects that have a hardness of 0? Well, the answer again is sorta disappointing. You see, Minecraft's got this mechanic called instant breaking. If your breaking power equals or exceeds the block's hardness times 30, you instantly break it. You've probably seen this in action if you've ever gone digging in the nether with a high-powered tool. You can even insta-break stone if you've got a netherite pickaxe, a strong enough efficiency level, and some haste. Now, instant is just about as fast as you can get, so instead let's go in the opposite direction. If you really, really hate yourself and want to spend as much time digging as possible, what's the longest you can possibly mine a single block using methods accessible in-game? As a baseline, we'll take a look at a stone block versus an iron pickaxe. No haste or mining fatigue, no water penalties, and on the ground. This yields a breaking power of 4.0 versus a hardness of 1.5, which comes out to 8 ticks or 0.4 seconds for each block. A totally reasonable amount of time. Now let's make it painful. The optimal setup for anti-speed running is this. Obsidian, barehanded, in water without aqua affinity, off the ground with no haste and mining fatigue 3. This yields a breaking power of around 0.0007 versus a hardness of 50, coming out to a grand total of 6,423 seconds, or about 107 minutes, or a little over an hour and a half. So, if for any particular reason you want to spend the better part of the afternoon punching a block that you aren't even gonna get, this is your key to success. And in case you're wondering, the absolute fastest you can break an obsidian block requires you to be wielding an efficiency 5 netherite pickaxe with haste 2, which yields a pretty impressive time of about 1.55 seconds per block. But wait a minute. Just a few minutes ago I stood here and told you obsidian wasn't actually the hardest block, and disregarding unbreakable blocks and liquids, reinforced deep slate was the true winner in this regard. And that is technically still true, but it's not as hard to break as obsidian. See, obsidian with its hardness of 50 has an unarmed break time of 250 seconds, while reinforced deep slate with its hardness of 55 has a break time of only 82.5. Now, how is this possible? Well, it all really comes down to one weird little quirk of the breaking system. You see, wood is actually harder than stone. It's got a hardness value of 2 versus stone's 1.5, and you don't spend nearly as much time mining it. If the calculations are run with wood acting exactly like stone, it should take 10 seconds for you to mine a single block of it with your hands. But here's where a little factor called harvesting comes into play. Because wood can technically be harvested, i.e. picked up after you break it with your hand, the breaking power is tripled. Since you can't pick up stone broken with your hands, it's a hell of a lot slower to break. Reinforced deep slate, weirdly enough, works about the same way. Despite the fact that you can't actually harvest it in any way, reinforced deep slate acts like a block of hardness 55 that has no appropriate tool but can be harvested with any tool, similar to something like a bed. Why this is remains a mystery for now, and obsidian regains its throne as the longest breaking block in the game. But say you aren't happy with 1.55 seconds. You're unhinged, you're completely deranged, and you want to break obsidian instantly. Now, you can't get this with normal breaking. 1.55 seconds is the absolute best you're going to get with in-game tools and utilities. But that's not the only way to break a block, is it? As Minecraft players have done for over a decade now, we turn to explosives. Now, explosive resistance, weirdly enough, doesn't have anything at all to do with hardness values. For the life of me, I could not tell you why, but Mojang decided a block's hardness in relation to explosives was going to be completely separate from its hardness value, relying instead on a weird little variable called blast resistance. Very often, hardness and blast resistance go hand in hand, but sometimes they really don't. A block of iron, for instance, despite being over 3 times harder than stone, has the exact same blast resistance, 6. Most blocks have a really low blast resistance comparatively, which is what makes explosives such an effective griefing tool, but I'm getting off topic here. Now, unfortunately for us, obsidian backs up its incredible 50 hardness with an even more impressive blast resistance of 1200, 500 times that of stone. This gives obsidian its legendary reputation as the ultimate blast protection block. But is it possible to destroy obsidian in one fell swoop if the player uses explosives? Well, yeah. Some among you might be aware of a weird little property regarding the Wither, namely that its blue skull projectile can destroy normally blast-proof blocks. Naturally, this includes obsidian. But does the blue Wither skull actually have the explosive power to override the obsidian's 1200 resistance? Well, no. Wither skulls have a blast power and therefore a damage and blast radius not that much stronger than a gassed fireball. Its ability to destroy obsidian and such is actually just a special property of the blue Wither skull and doesn't have anything to do with blast resistance. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this sort of feels like cheating to me. Not to mention the fact that getting a whole Wither out just to insta-break some obsidian doesn't seem like the best use of time. So I looked around a little bit more. Unfortunately, there is absolutely no way to generate an explosion in normal gameplay capable of breaking obsidian. The actual strongest in-game explosion, ironically, is also one that the Wither creates. Namely, it's that big shockwave it makes when it spawns in for the first time. The explosion has a power of 8, twice that of TNT, but not nearly enough to even scratch obsidian. Charged creepers and end crystals, a little less dangerous, only have blast powers of 6, even weaker than the Withers. So sadly, if you're sticking to normal gameplay, the only way to insta-break obsidian is with blue Wither skulls. But I ain't never really been one for sticking to normal gameplay. Once we enter the world of commands, a whole new avenue opens up. You see, through the use of commands, we can summon exploding things that have explosive power a lot greater than anything you'd normally be able to get in-game. Now, unfortunately, things like TNT and end crystals can't have their explosive power edited, so they're out of the equation. But you know what isn't? Creepers. Creepers have a special NBT tag called Explosion Radius. This can be used to jack up their explosive power, which normally sits at around 3, an explosion radius value of 1. Set off one of these things and it becomes a walking natural disaster. The explosion crater is impressive, but we run into yet another problem here. You see, the explosion radius value is a byte tag, meaning it can only store a value up to 127, just one short of 2 to the 7th. And sadly, at this value, the creeper just doesn't have it in them to crack obsidian. You can see this really cool pattern on the ground when it does happen. This is because explosives in Minecraft work by projecting out rays that deal damage along the way, and the obsidian blocked a ton of them, but the obsidian itself stands strong. Annoyingly, every other editable explosive source, notably ghasts as well as their fireballs, have the same limitation. Any value above 127 defaults to 0. But what if I told you it wasn't always this way? Let's take a trip back to 1.10. Now the 1.7 issue is no longer, because the explosion power tag of fireballs is now an integer value, meaning it can be ramped up to the 32-bit integer limit, or just under 2 to the 31st. To be a little more clear, that number is 2,147,483,647. So let's test it out. Steadily ramping up the explosive power of a fireball and launching it at some helpless obsidian, we can finally see something remarkable. At just around 300 explosion power, the fireball beats obsidian, and our question is finally answered. Here's the gigantic explosion crater that was required in order to do it. So knowing these, we're left with one final question, one that I'm not sure you guys have been asking, but I definitely have. Can you use the same method to break bedrock? The reason I didn't just plug it into my breaking calculator script is because blocks like bedrock don't have an arbitrarily high hardness value. They don't have a hardness of 1,000, a million, or even a billion. Unbreakable blocks have a hardness of -1, meaning you can mine away at them till hell freezes over and still make the same amount of progress, 0%. However, there is a crack in the armor. While barriers, command blocks, end portal frames, bedrock, and so on all have theoretically infinite hardness, their blast resistance is, for some strange reason, a finite number. Every so-called unbreakable block has a blast resistance of 3.6 million, except barriers and light blocks, which have a blast resistance of 3.6 million, 0.8, for some unknown reason that I can only hope to comprehend. But because this number is countable, just like Obsidian's 1200, is it technically possible to use a supercharged fireball to do the impossible and destroy the undestroyable? Well, yeah. You can do basically the same thing, except instead of 300, you gotta crank that value up to somewhere around 1 million. At this point, the explosion gets so powerful that the game needs about 15 minutes just to calculate it, but once it does, you can see the bedrock finally cracked under the pressure. And with this, we have officially done it. We have created a bomb so powerful, it destroys a block previously thought to be unbreakable. Sure, we needed the Minecraft equivalent of a thermonuclear warhead to do it, but the fact that it's possible is pretty amazing in and of itself. Now, in the future, if anyone asks you what hardness values are, you'll be able to provide an answer. And if you're feeling real talkative, you'll be able to tell them all about blast resistance, breaking times, and the exact explosive power required to break the unbreakable as well. After this, they'll probably look at you and say something to the effect of, "What the hell are you talking about?" But on the inside, they'll be just a little bit impressed. As before, like if you liked, comment if you commented, subscribe if you subscribed, so on and so forth, now and ever and under the ages of ages, amen. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.